Welcome to On Air, a podcast discussion at the intersection of artificial intelligence and international relations, where we will discuss the development of IR theory, law, and practice in the age of AI.
Welcome to the IR in the Age of AI podcast. I'm your host, Medlir. Misinformation and disinformation have become this year's buzzwords as voters in the United States, Russia, India, Iran, and another 36 countries have headed to or are on their way to the voting booths in 2024, along with dozens more scheduled in 2025. In the meantime, AI promises to exponentially increase the availability and production of information in all of its forms, with AI-generated fake videos, rumor bombs, and disinfo, as Ellen Fitzwilliam puts it. While the phenomena is global, the fight for the hearts and minds of voters is particularly heating up in countries bordering Russia, including countries in the Baltics and, of course, Central and Eastern Europe. To tell us more about these developments, I'm joined today by Lukas Andriukaitis. Lukas is a board member of the Lithuania-based Civic Resilience Initiative and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Lukas, welcome to On Air.
Hello.
But before anything else, let's talk a bit about you. Let's talk about the Civic Resilience Initiative. Now, you're based, as I said, in Vilnius, in Lithuania. Tell us a little bit about CRI. What's the impetus for the creation? What you guys up to?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to your show. It's great to be here. Sure. So CRI is a Lithuanian organization. We want to call ourselves a think tank, but we're not exactly right there at the moment. We're an educational center focusing on a few main topics, basically civic resilience in all different forms, and disinformation is a big one of them. And as an organization, I think we focus on a few directions of efforts. The first one being old-fashioned research, so short-term, long-term, mostly focusing on open source techniques and methods, to which we'll get back, I think, in a moment. Also, we do educational events, educational activities, and of this one, we're really proud about this because we're always trying to find ways how to teach about media literacy, about misinformation in a more interactive, exciting way, especially when it comes to the younger generation, because it's hard to capture their attention sometimes when you're in front of 30 kids and try to explain why this information is important. So in order to do it in a more fun way, we usually try to engage through gamification activities. And
what does that look like? What does gamification look like?
So there's a bunch of different projects. We're very happy with our longstanding scavenger hunts, which we do on the ground and also online. Yeah. So basically, we gather a bunch of kids, give them like an hour or so lecture about open source tools, about misinformation, disinformation, and we release them into the city with those tools and ask them to solve different challenges. So there are like stations or checkpoints throughout the city, and in order to get to another one, to get another clue, you need to solve a little exercise based on the knowledge that we just gave them. And it's really a lot of fun. So we involve other organizations, we involve other maybe stakeholders like NATO, EFP troops, who are oftentimes a victim of disinformation, which are being portrayed as the bad guys in the Russian disinfo. So we involve them so that the kids would have a chance to meet them, and so on and so on. And we also do the same online, slightly differently. We have a website where they need to solve a novel to find the missing journalists, also solving puzzles online, going scavenging around the whole internet, trying to find clues. So that's pretty exciting. But another thing that we just developed together with the help of Google, we created a media literacy game online based on Minecraft engine. So basically it feels and looks like a lot like Minecraft, but you need to log in and solve puzzles with your course mates or classmates online. So do like scenarios. And we usually travel through schools, gather kids, and for a few hours play online games with them. And it's usually quite fun. So that game is free to play and it's online, and you can also check it out if you want.
Yeah, definitely. We've had conversations here where I am and in other places consistently about this concern with misinformation, disinformation. So, or just information, how to get over our cognitive biases. It's actually my co-host Chris says, well, is it possible that somebody's misinformation is just somebody else's just information? The labels also tend to be used a little bit too liberally in a way, and we end up painting accurate information as mis or disinformation. I think that's problematic, and I think some people have raised questions about that, and that's probably something to address as well. Now, you mentioned that, because I want to get to this question of the impetus for CRI. Well, why does it exist? And then you mentioned that oftentimes just putting students in front of NATO forces, for example. You do have a base, I think, is it a Dutch base in just outside of Civic?
It's a mix. It's a mix. It's led by the Germans, but there's a huge contingent of Dutch troops, Czech troops. It's a good mix of people.
All right. And you're saying that one of the ways to kind of combat misunderstanding, I guess, or combat information that may be skewed is to just bring some of these students face to face with the NATO forces and others. But this also underlines Lithuania's kind of geostrategic location and the kinds of issues that you are facing. So tell us a bit about what Lithuania is faced with and what CRI is trying to do. How are those two issues related?
Sure. So you put it really well. We're on the very border of free Europe. We're the last countries of democracies. And we have quite a bit of issues with our neighbors, especially one neighbor to the east. So we're always on the brink of threats, both in the disinformation space, but also on somewhat hybrid space as well. We had issues where Belarus has instigated a bunch of illegal migrants to cross the border in droves, and that actually was a hybrid attack on our society, followed by disinformation campaigns that's trying to skew the reality, not only for Lithuanians, but also how Lithuanians look to other Europeans and our NATO allies. So yeah, it's really problematic. And on top of that, we're in Lithuania, we have quite a sizable ethnic Russian minority, Russian speaker minority, Polish speaking minority as well. I would say to some extent tend to be incorporated sometimes into the information bubbles, which are influenced by the Russian media on purpose. So trying to depict different realities of Lithuania, of EU, of NATO. And so this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So the impetus of CRI is to educate them, make them more resilient to unfriendly disinfo, misinfo, to give them tools and understanding how to navigate information online space, and to make them not as vulnerable to Russian attacks in information space.
But you mentioned, again, some of these allies or some of these organizations with whom you've worked, and I was looking at your website in preparation for today's interview. You've got the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Wilfred Martens Center for European Studies, Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, and others. This seems like a very illustrious list. But then there was one organization that caught my eye, and I can't not ask. Lithuanian Elves. Tell me, I know this isn't, maybe I should interview them next, but what do we need to know about this?
I think you definitely should. The problem is that it's hard to put a finger on them sometimes.
Okay.
Because the organization's strength actually lies in the fact that they're loosely connected volunteers who spend their free time fighting disinformation online, but actually fighting it, not only talking about it, teaching about it, but also doing counteroffensives or trying to drown a bad actor in the comments online or something like that. So
this is akin to Anonymous a little bit, but it's a Lithuanian version of Anonymous, but dealing a lot more with misinfo and disinfo.
A little bit. They actually, the name I really like because I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan myself. Okay. So the name derives from the natural enemies of the orcs and the trolls. So we all know internet trolls. So who are the best guys to fight them? So these guys lurk in the shadows of the internet and they try to make the social media a little bit more clean. And the way they usually do it, I don't want to talk too much about their tactics, but one of them is to point in a coordinated manner to Facebook, Twitter, or other social media platforms on the misbehavings or actually problems that there are. Because it's no secret that all the big social media giants have issues with threat analysis and overall and having an in-depth understanding on what is happening on their platforms, especially when it concerns smaller countries.
Yeah.
So imagine how many employees are responsible for the Baltic states. It's 6 million or so inhabitants. So in the big picture, we might seem irrelevant, but 3 countries, 3 different languages, 3 completely different social, political situations. And if you don't know in and outs, or if you don't have Lithuanian or Estonian speakers, you're not going to understand which are the bad guys, which are trolls, which are using sarcasm or anything like that.
Right.
So elves actually do this heavy lifting of pointing, reporting, addressing, sometimes commenting on the bad stuff, and so on and so on, trying to take some of the bad things down. So
relatedly, though, CRI, together with all these organizations, you've done some really important work. A couple of recent reports that you have authored. One of them was a study of anti-Ukrainian war propaganda in the Baltic states. Another one is a policy paper on Russian and Chinese disinformation efforts in Lithuania and Taiwan. And I thought that latter one kind of interesting, but maybe let's take each of them at one by one. So first, the anti-Ukrainian war propaganda in the Baltic states. What did you find?
We found quite a few things as the war started. Well, the backstory is that when the war started in Ukraine, the last full-scale invasion a couple of years back, Lithuania was one of the staunch supporters and still remains to be one of the staunch supporters of Ukraine. And naturally, that was not very convenient for Russia. And at the very first stages of the war, I would say Lithuania and the Baltic states, and maybe most of Europe, was facing the problem of misinformation overall, because Russian trolls and the Russian disinfo actors had better things to do, trying to work with the mess they caused in Ukraine. But as the war progressed, I think more and more attention was being targeted at other countries as well. So in the Baltic countries, in Lithuania, as we found in our reports, a large portion of their focus was basically try and affect severe ties with Ukraine in many ways. So trying to find stories about the refugees, why the refugees are bad for Lithuania, for Lithuanian economy, or trying to invent stories about how ungrateful the Ukrainians are, trying to stoke tensions on that level. Also trying to cause dissatisfaction with the government, who's a staunch supporter of Ukraine as well, juxtaposing the money that is being spent on help to Ukraine against small pinch, or the social care being not as big as it could be, and so on and so on.
So in some areas, in some issues, there would be no relation to the Ukraine conflict. It's just that you're targeting the government and society for dysfunction, trying to dissipate trust. And so, okay.
And also trying to show Lithuania and the Baltic states as warmongers to EU, or maybe to other nations in Europe who are maybe not as hawkish on Russia, like Germany or Italy, trying to show them as the Lithuania, the Baltics as the troublemakers, and as the ones that will bring the war to Europe as well.
And what does one do under these circumstances? We'll get a little bit back towards the end of our discussion today on the tools available to combat that. But in this particular case, where obviously you identify these kinds of patterns, the government obviously knows it's coming under attack. What is the answer? And what did you find, actually? Are governments in democracies, are they prepared to handle these kinds of attacks?
Well, yes and no. If we would compare the situation today that we have with like a few years back, it's significantly better because NGOs and think tanks are talking about this issue nonstop. So naturally it gets better. Still not perfect, and also it depends on country to country basis. So Lithuania, I think we are doing slightly better maybe than the rest of EU, because some of the policies that we did regarding the Russian TV channels, Russian media outlets operating in Lithuania, and also on social media, Lithuanian government has been in close contact with Facebook and trying to find common solutions to some of the issues that was happening on their platform. It still is. So naturally one of the things that we do and we try to do is talking loudly about it in order for them to do something about it. The other thing is education, because it's a long-term game, but we're, as an organization, me personally, I believe in that wholeheartedly. I really think that if we deal with clean education and especially work with the younger ones, with the young generation, we're going to achieve good results maybe someday in the future. And also doing that classic debunking positive narratives and all that work, trying to find how they're trying to attack us, give this information to some of our partners like Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, other NGOs, journalists, trying to give them a bigger picture on what is happening online and give them a chance to strategize about it.
Okay. Well, like I said, I want to come back a little bit to how we combat this towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at first, just one last question, then we'll move to the AI part of this. But Russia, China, Lithuania, Taiwan. I think I understand the connection. My bigger question is, do you see any evidence of Russia and China kind of sharing authoritarian best practices? Do you see patterns? Do you see communication? How do those efforts compare? China versus Taiwan, Russia versus Lithuania?
Well, it's also China against Lithuania.
Okay, interesting. All right. Well, tell us about that.
Sure. So that's a big one as well, because we had quite a feud with them when Lithuania opened not exactly an embassy, but a permanent representation of Taiwan.
Right.
China did not like that one bit, so we have been the victims of disinformation attacks from China as well. But I think that started like around the COVID times as well. So we were not only tracking that part of, not only that line of disinformation, but also disinfo and misinfo about COVID as well. China trying to portray themselves not being the problem, not the cause, but more of a solution, trying to pull strings within Europe to cause some commotion there. So we were tracking that as well. But to put it very well as well, that there has been learning from China's side, from Russia, about the best practices, and we actually seen quite a bit of the same patterns. China creating these media outlets for facing towards English-speaking audiences, right, very much like RT or other big ones that Russia created years ago, using bots, trolls, especially diplomats and official accounts, which have like quite a bit of a reach online, using them and then stoking narratives or supporting narratives or creating narratives from scratch and then using those media outlets to support them. So a lot of the best practices that we see from China are actually maybe not invented, but used by Russia for years. So there's definitely that. So there are synergies. I wouldn't say that they're cooperating on a huge level. I think naturally, if they see a synergy, for example, bashing Lithuania, they might join forces, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. If they don't. The politics between those two countries are quite complex in many ways. But on this information level, if they can, they'll jump on the same wagon and just roll with it. So there are examples of that, yeah.
Yeah, now I'm thinking, for our listeners, Lithuania is a very small country. The Baltics generally are. And the way you described it also, because you were talking about Lord of the Rings, I'm thinking about one of these like outposts out there, just kind of just faced with this behemoth next door. And then you have China added on to that picture. That's just, that's a no-win situation, as I am not sure. And of course, this is where being part of NATO, being part of the European Union helps, obviously, and being part of a larger community. But I can imagine the challenges of combating this kind of information campaign can be quite daunting. On this topic, to make things worse, I mentioned in my opening remarks the worsening impact that AI, artificial intelligence, is likely to have in this information space. I also mentioned this connection to 2024, 2025. It's the only thing that people are talking about now is elections. I think we're about 80 countries are going to go to the voting booth between now and the end of next year, 2025. Most of the world's population will be electing new government. This won't happen again. This almost feels like a celestial phenomenon, like a cosmic phenomenon. This won't happen again. This eclipse won't happen again for another 20, 30 years. So come in and take a look. Just make sure you wear your glasses. And I guess it's an appropriate maybe metaphor to use here, because
it's like a comet almost.
Right. Or we do have a solar eclipse happening here in North America shortly, and you got to have the right filters to make sure you can actually see that eclipse properly. And we are talking here about filtering information in a way that protects us from the negative kind of side effects of that and gives us the benefits of the rest of it. But this is the context in which, even at the Munich Security Conference, you had the big tech companies promised that they would try and introduce some kind of protocols, tools to help with this battle against misinformation, disinformation. So clearly this is a challenge, partly because, again, this is the first time we're seeing this confluence, this event. That's where we have this huge number of people going to the voting booths. And it's not just like, it's not small countries. These are big countries. And I mentioned Russia, United States, India, Iran, I think, just had elections beginning of March. And so what is the impact, you think? Because, again, this issue of propaganda, psyops, all this other stuff, this is ongoing. This has been going on for decades. This is not new. But AI is new. How do you see the impact of AI in the middle of this conversation?
Yeah, that's one of the questions that keeps me up at night, because the disinformation and misinformation challenges have been there for dozens of years.
Right.
And it's not going away in any way. So it's just getting worse in some cases. And yeah, you're very much right. Like, if used correctly, if used efficiently, like, disinfo and misinfo can target specific countries, can win hearts and minds of like a specific group of people who might elect someone who will do a lot of damage in the future. Like, an example of US, like, if you aim for the swing states, you might get a different result than otherwise you would. So, of course, this challenge is out there.
And by the way, the European Union, the European Parliament is having elections in June as well. Yeah. So that's another big actor, which I failed to also mention. And in the context of Russia-Ukraine conflict and everything that's happening, there's this could be really defining in terms of the outcome of these elections.
100%. And if you lose, like, well, not lose, but like, if a country or two after elections, for example, against Ukraine support, that's a huge blow, because there's not enough support at the moment anyways. So, of course, that's a big challenge. And AI just gives you another layer of problems and solutions, maybe, which we can discuss a little bit as well.
Right.
But the main issue with the way that I see AI challenges it's twofold. One is that AI gives you a bunch of tools to more easily create disinfo, misinfo, or basically create content. So it allows you to create fake videos, create photos of people that don't exist, that look like real. So fill in some of the gaps that otherwise would require a lot of manpower and time to create. Of course, you can Photoshop a photo, but if you can create it in seconds using some AI tool, it's far, far easier. Or if you can create a bunch of photos and use them for your fake profile in seconds, then it's really, really easy. So photos, videos, all of that is one part of the picture. And then there's the whole other issue, the whole other Pandora's box, which I don't think enough people will realize, is the LLM part of AI, so the large language modules. And for those who haven't heard this term, the easiest example is ChatGPT.
Right.
So we're moving in light speed towards that. If you compare like ChatGPT 3 and ChatGPT 4, there's a huge difference. We're getting into the zone where you can chat with LLM and have troubles with understanding, are you chatting with a human or you're chatting with an algorithm. And the problem is that before LLMs became a thing, automation was a big issue in this information space. Basically bots. The good thing about bots was that they were pretty stupid. They wouldn't generate content. They usually would just reshare topics or pretend a topic to be more important than it actually is. Once we merge automation with large language models, we're getting a pretty bad mix, because you can automatically create a bunch of hundreds, thousands of accounts, give them like guidance, directions, and make them talk about anything online. So if you do that correctly, it might be an issue not only for users of social media accounts to understand who they're talking with, but also the platforms to understand which one of those are run by LLMs and which are the actual accounts. So this is a dystopian future that I'm pretty concerned about. So those are the two sides of the AI.
What do you see as defenses or as the upside of AI in this space?
With AI, I think another interesting potential that AI holds is that AI might become a source of truth as well, depending on how it goes. Because AI is pretty good, and we're doing a lot of experiments with that, trying to work with LLMs and how it assesses information. And it's actually, at least ChatGPT is pretty good in understanding which articles, for example, are written in like pro one narrative or pro one other. It understands who is the potential audience of this article. It understands what might be the underlying message and so on and so on. So if AI and LLMs go in the right direction, if they are neutral and give you pretty good answers without any bias within, people might turn to that and say, hey, AI, read these 30 articles from my local news media paper and say if they're biased or unbiased. And AI might do that. At the same time, we need to hope that AI will develop in the right direction, because we recently saw quite a comical situation with Gemini, where some of the rules that were built in by the developers about trying to keep the AI more pro-diverse, being pro-diverse and pro-inclusive and so on, it's actually turned to a more comical side, which was unable to portray some races and so on and so on. So if that becomes associated with AI overall, people will distrust it. So you never know where it goes. But like talking strictly about LLMs, and maybe I don't want to promote ChatGPT, but like it's the tests we did, it's actually pretty good in understanding messages with it. So that could be a remedy, like even for us researchers. Why we don't want to spend all our days reading through propaganda outlets and trying to understand what Russian disinfo actors mean. If LLM does that for us, we can just get the results and make our conclusions out of those. So it might save some time for us.
And is this something that eventually we can envision just doing as an add-on, like a browser add-on, where just the browser just completely just filters or indicates the likelihood of the source of one information or the other? I
feel like it's a matter of time that something like this happens. And another very interesting idea, which fascinates me, is that we might move in the direction that we will use LLMs and AI, because there's a bunch of them. There's Gemini, ChatGPT, Llama, whatever. We will not listen to what a single one of them says. We will use them as a council. We will ask 10 of them at the same time and ask them to make a single conclusion.
Interesting.
And most likely they will find the actual answer somewhere in the middle. They'll meet in the middle. So that's another very fascinating topic.
Yeah, of course.
That is interesting to think about.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a wisdom of crowds, but in this case would be a wisdom of GPTs. That's very good. We do already kind of do this in a semi-structured experiment on our own, where we're trying to produce something and then we say, okay, let's see what ChatGPT comes up with and let's see what Gemini comes up with. And it seems that the more of these we have, the better it is. Let me end with one question here. Again, Lithuania is part of the European Union. The EU always led the way in terms of, for different reasons, by the way, not always for the best of intentions, but just at least the historical record is that it's led kind of the way in terms of legislating and setting the rules and the standards, whether it's in the digital kind of like rights area or in the case of the EU with the AI. We obviously in January just had the act approved, and then there's now a new office, the EU office on AI. There are AI ambassadors across various European countries. But let me just ask you, just last question. What do you think is the impact of legislation like the EU AI Act on efforts for organizations like yourselves, but also countries in general, individuals, to combat misinformation and disinformation? Do you see it playing an important role, or do you think that we need some more additional guardrails and guidelines?
I think it's a good first step. I guess it will bring some challenges, just like, I don't know, like other good initiatives like GDPR. Of course, it's in Europe, it's a great thing, but also it's easier for some of the actors or some of the people to hide behind it and doing some of the bad stuff. So it's like pros and cons of it. But I think the initial steps are pretty good. The one thing that bothers me a little bit more talking about the EU is that I feel like they're pretty late in the AI game overall.
Right.
The AI game is actually happening in US and China. And if EU is just going to regulate what's out there, it's not going to be in the winning position. So, of course, it's not a bad thing. I think it's actually a good step and trying to regulate it. But if it's just going to be reactionary, then EU is just going to sit and watch and try to react to whatever US and China comes up with.
Yeah, I've heard that actually critique quite a bit, is that at the end of it, even by the time that this was regulated or agreed on, technology had moved beyond some of these kinds of scenarios that the EU AI Act had foreseen. And so then you have to keep on playing catch up. In which case you apply the American model, which is more in the form of executive direct, more kind of self-enforcing when you let big tech kind of govern themselves. And I'm not sure that that's also an ideal solution, but perhaps to let kind of market forces, I guess, dictate. And it's kind of just like with Gemini, if you come up with a product that is just not up to par, people are just going to kind of respond to that. And so perhaps that's where it is. Well, Lukas, thank you so much for joining us. This has been, for me, very interesting and eye-opening, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you kindly for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course. And I think next time we'll just do this in Lithuania. We'll record a special episode then.
Wonderful.
And of course, thank you to all our listeners. As always, if you like the show, we invite you to subscribe and leave us a comment. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, don't forget to join us for the next episode for a discussion at the intersection of AI and IR theory, law, and practice. Until then, stay human.